All right, back on the Young Turks, Cenk, Uygur, and Anna Kasparian with you guys. As usual, let's read some quick comments. And if you, these are just members, tyt.com/join to become a member. Collecting Mr. Lania says, at this point, many war zone areas are safer for journalists to cover than the protests in the U.S. And Proletariat Rising says, hey, guys, I've got a great idea. Let's respond to protests about police brutality with police brutality. That'll show them. And unfortunately, that's like literally what has happened here. So many other wonderful comments, and thank you for using YouTube Super Chat. But we got so much more news to give you guys, so let's keep going.
Donald Trump gave a Rose Garden address where he threatened to use the military against U.S. citizens who are part of the Black Lives Matter protests. These protests are taking place throughout the country. Unfortunately, there have been instances of looting, and Trump purposely conflates the peaceful protesters with the looters, and that's not a mistake. Now, that speech was horrifying. What he was suggesting with the military was disgusting and undemocratic. And to make matters worse, he met the peaceful protesters in the area with violence. He had the, authorities basically viciously attack them and clear the area so he can do a ridiculous photo op to appeal to his evangelical base. Now, with all that said, the takeaway from the New York Times was this unbelievable headline. As chaos spreads, Trump vows to end it now. Okay, so let's just discuss how grossly this misrepresents Donald Trump's intentions and what he was calling for. Someone who doesn't know much about politics, maybe someone who didn't watch that Rose Garden address, would read that headline and think, Donald Trump is a hero. Look at, he's going to stop the chaos. That's exactly what we need. He's a leader. When in reality, he's not a leader. He's Bunker Boy who hid out in an underground bunker when there were protests in front of the White House. And then his thin skin was punctured by people calling him Bunker Boy. So he turned around and tried to play strongman by threatening to use the military against peaceful U.S. protesters. How are you going to watch that speech and then turn around and use that ridiculous headline? Like, it's the most infuriating thing I've ever seen. Not ever. I mean, this is how many times? How many times has the New York Times made this mistake, right? Done this, disservice to their readers. I'll give you some more examples. Mediaite reported the journalistically dubious headline evoked a similarly administration-friendly effort from last summer when the Times put out a grossly generous polish on a presidential speech in the wake of 2 mass shootings that targeted minorities. Trump urges unity versus racism. That was the original headline. But that headline, which the executive editor later acknowledged was bad, was subsequently changed for later print editions into assailing hate but not guns. Online, the Times ultimately went with a much more contextualized Trump condemns white supremacy, but stops short of major gun controls. Yeah, I mean, those headlines, I guess, are like marginally better, but not by much. They still paint this very positive light of Donald Trump, when in reality, he himself is a white supremacist. He himself is a white supremacist. It's just incredible that these are so-called journalists. They're pathetic.
So I want to talk about the substance of this particular story, and then I want to move on to the larger context that Anna's referring to. So the takeaway from last night's speech were from a journalism point of view, were 2 major takeaways. One is saying that the president will use the United States military inside the country. That's amazing, unprecedented. It's a giant story. That's the headline. How do you watch that and think, oh, that's not the important part of the story? Him vowing to end chaos is the important part of the story. No, that's a standard line that anyone would say. You know what? Obama as president could have had the same exact headline, but Obama's speech and Trump's speech would have been massively different, and they were different. So the second newsworthy item was that Donald Trump mentioned the Second Amendment for no reason in the middle of the speech. The speech had nothing to do with the Second Amendment. No Second Amendment rights have been challenged. So that is a potential call to arms and vigilante violence. So that's super newsworthy. So these are real headlines if you had mentioned those. I wouldn't have mentioned the Second Amendment one in the big headline because, although it's super important, because using the military inside the country is so much bigger and unprecedented. But so why does the New York Times do this? This is not about Donald Trump. And so I appreciate all the folks who are now waking up and challenging the New York Times and saying, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't seem quite accurate. It seems like you're almost covering up for them. Yeah, that's what the New York Times does for the powerful as a regular course of business. But it's, to be fair to the New York Times, it's all of the mainstream media that all they ever do is give positive headlines for the people in power. It's not that they've forgotten that they're supposed to challenge the powerful. They're supposed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. It's that they never believed in that in the first place. If you're in the government, well, I'm your stenographer. I will say the government said this, and it is a very credible source. If you don't have power, not credible, not legitimate, we won't cover it. It is a matter of course. So the mainstream media is fundamentally broken. Now, if you're saying, hey, Cenk, have you really believed that all along? Well, I got some proof for you. So this is exactly what the press was doing during the Bush era, and it drove me crazy back then as well. And so in this case, it was a USA Today headline about the Iraq war effort and how George Bush was doing. This was in the midst of the Iraq war being a complete disaster. It had devolved into massive civil war. We lost so many of our troops there, and already hundreds of thousands of civilians had died. It was just a nightmare of epic proportions. And then this happened.
Show the goddamn paper right here. Picture, headline, USA safer. Bush says. Okay. USA Today, you that is a lie. They've done a terrible job. Every one of these editors in every major newspaper, in every major magazine, in every major television news organization should be fired today.
So, look, that's a fun clip. It's fairly well known in internet circles, at least. But the core of, outside the yelling, the core of it is Bush says he keeps USA safer. New York Times now says, as chaos spreads, Trump vows to end it now. It's always the same headline. Person in power says he's doing something wonderful, and since I'm not a reporter or an editor, I just put it up on the page, on the paper, and did propaganda on his behalf. And so the main difference in my point of view between then and now, and it's been a depressingly long time that they've been doing this, and we've been doing this, and covering it and pointing out their problems, is that I no longer think that the editors and the reporters are getting their job wrong. I just realized I was wrong about the job that they're supposed to be doing. I thought they were in the news business. And it turns out in mainstream media, they're mainly in the compliance business. So if you're looking to get your readership to comply, and you yourself view your main job as complying to the people in power, then bravo, New York Times, USA Today, and the others. You've done a wonderful job.
Yeah, look, just keep in mind that any brainless twit can go ahead and just regurgitate what someone in power claims or says. Support independent media, please, because if it weren't for independent media, there'd be no one challenging the narratives that you see in corporate-owned press. You just wouldn't ever see anyone challenging it. And luckily now we do have independent media, you know, I hesitate to say thriving, but it exists and it has a sizable audience. So please support independent media, especially during these tough times, because it's tough out there, you know, especially when you're not, when you don't have the corporate backing that these other legacy media outlets have.
But I'll add one thing to that. Look, this story is about mainstream media overall. You know, I'm glad independent media is out there as an alternative, obviously. Don't forget the heart of the story. Keep challenging the papers, the TV stations, the radio stations that you see to do better, okay? I don't know that it'll ever change, but also support the independent media. It doesn't just have to be us. It could be Democracy Now!, The Intercept, The Guardian, you name it. A lot of American Prospect, a lot of people doing wonderful jobs, okay? But, New York Times has done great propaganda for itself, as if they're like the guardians of things that are true. The paper of record. That's actually half true. The paper of record for the powerful. If you want something printed in the paper, the New York Times, if you're powerful, will print it for you. So, and what have they done? In the era of Trump, things like the New York Times have sucked up all the subscription. So everybody subscribed thinking that they were part of the resistance. New York Times ain't part of the resistance. If you ask them, they'll tell you, we're not part of the resistance. I mean, in their ideal, they're like neutral. We're totally, utterly neutral. Fascist, anti-fascist, I can't tell the difference at all. A tyrannical government, a government that cares about democracy, I can't. What am I, a reporter? I can't tell the difference. I'm neutral. So, and unfortunately, since they do such great marketing on their own behalf, a lot of people think, oh my God, I got to subscribe to the New York Times to find out what's in the news. No, support independent media. You'll actually find out reality. If you want to support the powerful, yes, support mainstream media.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.